However, this seems to have come to an end with the birth of Christ. The Jews ended 2,000 years of diaspora until the Holocaust and the creation of Israel, which is seen by many as a major sign that we are entering the end times, when God's final judgment will be rendered upon mankind. Is it possible that America's increasingly sinful nature, embodied by Hollywood and pornography, and most notably by the killing of 55 to 60 million of God's children by abortion, has angered God to the point where we no longer are the promised land, and therefore we have become vulnerable to our greatest enemies? Who is our greatest enemy? Communism. But what exactly is communism, at least as it stands in 2017? Incredibly, the answer to this question is not an easy one. It defies the understanding of even the most learned scholars. It is, in fact, a cancer, a disease. It is spread all over the world and cannot be eradicated. Where the Nazis were very obvious on its face as to who they were, what their methods were, their goals and desires, communism is amorphous and it cannot be ground down to a group of people, any particular country, ethnicity, region, or any other identifiable trait. It once stood for fairly obvious goals: one world government, an international military political system under the banner of Russia's hammer and sickle, the violent defeat of the U.S. and subjugation of free peoples under its authority. For reasons utterly beyond common sense, a large portion of free, educated, and otherwise decent people either did not think it a major threat or even sympathized with its aims in one form or another. Most of these goals became obsolete between the 1970s and early 1990s. First, Vietnam was a Pyrrhic victory for communism, in which a so-called victory came at a cost that was far greater than the value of the achievement. This weakened international communism to the point where its adventures in Latin America, Africa, and eventually Afghanistan, combined with the pressure applied by President Reagan and Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, brought the entire system crumbling to the ground. So how does communism continue to be an entity? Only by understanding that it is not merely a defeated political ideology, but rather the tool of an actual spirit we know as the devil, and that the offshoot of this tool in the free world are its natural offshoots, even allies, liberalism and socialism. Can we begin the necessary work of identifying this disease, just as any doctor must identify the disease in a patient? The problem is that this disease has metastasized and is so widespread it is wholly impossible to eliminate it, for reasons that can only be attributed to Satan. While the Nazis are easily isolated, polarized, and any whiff of identification with them is rightly subject to immediate disqualification from meaningful society, tacit, even outright sympathy or even membership in communist organizations is swept aside by most. In the past 8 years, the United States of America was led by a president who, by all accounts, learned Marxism at the knee of a card-carrying member of the Communist Party between age 9 and his entrance, paid for by entities unknown to this day, to an expensive private college at age 18. There was a time in the lives of many Americans in which such a fact would automatically disqualify one from the office and, more likely, result in such a person being impeached and jailed. Those days have passed. The circumstances allowing such a disaster cannot be explained beyond the hand of evil. President Barack Obama's Director of Central Intelligence, John Brennan, revealed at the end of his term that in 1980, when he was in college and Ronald Reagan was winning a landslide election on the premise or the promise to defeat our mortal enemies, communism, that very CIA director did, in fact, vote for the communist candidate. These items which range from verified as fact by the individual in question to unchallenged and therefore stipulated as truth, have raised nary a ripple in the media or the body politic. Sure, there are screams and shouts from the silent majority, but the very fact these screams and shouts have not resulted in active efforts to end such things from being events that happen in America is endemic of the sickness in America. Perhaps the most telling aspect of this accusation is in identifying what the early communists felt was important and the methods they used to deliver their ideas into our culture. V.I. Lenin, founder of the USSR, said as early as 1920 or 1921 that of all the arts, cinema is the most important. The Soviets recognized early that Hollywood was the most vulnerable and influential niche in American culture. One of the most telling works revealing communist plans comes in a 1927 novel by the socialist author Upton Sinclair, Oil. This book was the template for the 2007 film There Will Be Blood. But the communism of the novel was not revealed in the film, probably because it was too true a thing for the entertainment industry to allow Americans to learn about them. The communists had a dedicated spy apparatus in America in the 1920s. All of this was revealed by Whittaker Chambers in Witness. One of the ways the communists subversively embedded their anti-American ideas into our culture was through bohemianism. One of the early communists, Red Emma Goldman, was motivated largely by hatred of her patriarchal father, by lesbianism, by free love in the form of orgies and refuting traditional marriage, and by despoiling all vestiges of what might be called traditional values. The communists spread homosexuality and promiscuity in America, often using these as tools of blackmail. They encouraged nudity, running on the beach naked, wearing hair in long and frizzy manner, and disdaining the clothes of capitalism, for instance, suits and ties, in favor of workers' garb. All of this is described in Oil and foreshadows the Beats, the hippies, and the protest generation of the 1960s, none of which is a coincidence. They saw as natural targets blacks, Jews, lesbians, homosexuals, misfits, and unattractive women who were often unable to find husbands, and therefore were susceptible to an explanation as to why they could not fit in. One of Sinclair's stereotypes, seen as the character that lures the son of an oil magnate to communism to cleanse his bourgeoisie guilt, is a Jewish girl with exceptionally curly hair who purposefully hides any hint of physical attractiveness, whose ugliness is worn as a kind of uniform, not unlike the protesters of the Vietnam War. But what is most telling is the treatment of blacks, Jews, homosexuals, and undesirables in communist countries, not merely the USSR, but in Red China, Cuba, and virtually all communist nations. Jews were arguably the first Marxists and Bolsheviks, and were disproportionately the most traitorous of American communists, but their usefulness, often in the form of intellectualism, was quickly swept by the wayside. By the end of Stalin's reign of terror, the Jews were virtually liquidated from the Soviet Union, including a purging of Jewish doctors, a strange dynamic that no doubt increased sickness and death in this depraved country. It is not inconceivable at all that in the history of the Soviet Union, the communists murdered more Jews than Hitler, 6 million. Then there were the blacks. While there were virtually no blacks living in Russia, the experience of the American communist Paul Robeson is telling indeed. Subject to racism in the U.S., he decided communism was the antidote to it. Communists infiltrated the civil rights movement, but when asked about this at a HUAC meeting, baseball great Jackie Robinson told the committee he knew the communists were trying to indoctrinate blacks, but African Americans were too Christian, and too patriotic to fall for it. This might be the nicest thing anybody has ever said about African Americans. But Robeson fell for communism hook, line, and sinker until he actually went to live in the Soviet Union. He was quickly disenchanted and returned to the U.S., where he gave a deathbed confession repudiating the communists. His protege, however, actor-singer Harry Belafonte, never lived in the USSR and therefore never learned what communism really is. His is typical of the current cultural predicament. Belafonte is a 100% communist. He and the left would deny it, and even in his own heart, he probably does not believe it. He thrives in capitalism, is rich, and lives amongst the American beautiful people. But the things he says about Republicans and conservatives are so vile, foul, untruthful, and abhorrent as to only be the words of an evil spirit, a devil. Nevertheless, he is a hero to the left, a civil rights icon who, because he faced some discrimination once, is immune from any cursory examination of his character. He is handsome and talented and loved, the essence of cultural hipness, and a picture of a pernicious sickness that has spread across Western society, infecting a good 1/3 of our mostly clueless population. The people who listen to and love the Harry Belafontes of the world, indeed, Belafonte himself is one of them, were accurately described by Stalin as useful idiots who freely promote the values of communism in non-communist countries. They do the work of the communists. Nobody has to blackmail or coerce them. Blacks were badly discriminated against in Fidel Castro's Cuba as well. Castro, Che Guevara, and the communist leadership considered themselves Europeans, owing to their Spanish roots and seeing the blacks as mere slave chattel. But the communists viewed Latinos as natural fodder for expansion, from the immigrant farm communities of America to the Mexican underclass and, led by Guevara, violent revolution in Latin America. Use of homosexuals as a means to dilute American greatness is very telling. The communists did not want minorities, homosexuals, or even intellectuals in positions of leadership. When Marxist thinkers began to develop a following, Stalin had them purged. The communists realized that society needed strict discipline and order, generally military in nature. This left no room for the lame, the undesirable, and in particular, the homosexual, who were viewed as antithetical to order. What they wanted were for those they viewed as second-rate and of low quality: blacks, Jews, Latinos, lesbians, homosexuals, the weak, the unpatriotic, the cowardly, the unimpressive, to promote communism in America, to therefore dilute the strength of the United States. These methods can be viewed as mirroring the work of Satan, who seeks out the weak and the spiritually impoverished of his targets for hell. Of course, the average liberal reads this and thinks it Christian hogwash, which of course makes him the very sort the devil targets. At this point, there seems little reasonable, at least worldly, possibility that to plainly write such philosophical tenets will actually lead any large group of liberals to a change of heart. Then again, as the Gospel of Matthew so eloquently states, with man nothing is possible. With God, all things are possible.